It is my pleasure today to welcome Professor Bruce Usher to deliver what will be the 100th presentation via Zoom to the Canadian Association of the Club of Rome. Originally from Ottawa, Bruce has an MBA from Harvard and is a faculty director and professor at Columbia Business School. As you see from the slide, he has professional experience in finance and investment, focusing on climate solutions. Bruce's second book is coming out later this year, covering the topic of his talk today, Investing in the Era of Climate Change. With a deadly heat wave in South Asia, just the latest in a litany of adverse climate-related events, the topic has never been more relevant. The US Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm recently called renewable energy the greatest peace plan this world will ever know. Will sound investing in the era of climate change pave the way to peace and prosperity? Bruce, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you for that kind introduction. Thank you, Art, and all the members of the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome for inviting me this afternoon. It's good. Really enjoy speaking to you from my office at Columbia University in New York City on a beautiful Wednesday afternoon. So I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes or so, plus or minus, on investing in the era of climate change. My perspective on climate change is from that of business and investments, which may be a somewhat unusual perspective in the sense that I'm sure you've heard many speakers on the science of climate change, which obviously underlies everything that I'll be speaking about today. Before I get to that, though, let me begin with a question that I like to ask my audiences on this topic, which is, when we think about business, what has been the greatest influence on business in the past 3 decades? And that question turns out to be mostly agreed by almost all in the business world. And the answer is technology. Technology has upended every industry in business today, from retail to automobiles, entertainment to telecom. Doesn't really matter what sector of the business world you've been in the last 3 decades. Technology has changed everything about how you run your business and how you succeed or fail in business. And the impact of technology on business has, of course, implications for investors. In 1992, if we looked at the 10 most valuable companies globally by market capitalization, the value of those companies, of the top 10 in the world, only one was a technology company. Today, out of the top 10 in the world, 7 are tech companies. So tech has changed everything in business. So that was the past. And now as we look ahead, say the next 30 years, the greatest impact on business will be, this won't surprise you, climate change. And the reason for that is pretty simple. The global economy, everything that was built and created since the Industrial Revolution of 3 centuries ago, it all emits greenhouse gases. And that worked pretty well for about 300 years. It allowed humanity to rise up from abject poverty to a pretty decent standard of living for much, if not most, of the world's population. But a global economy based on burning fossil fuels and emitting greenhouse gases, it's no longer sustainable. And I'm going to assume you're well aware of the risk of catastrophic climate change as part of this group, which when I refer to catastrophic climate change, what I'm really talking about is a warming of more than 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. Fortunately, there is a path to avoiding a catastrophic outcome. And that path has been clearly spelled out in the latest IPCC report that came out just over a month ago. And it's very clear on what we have to do to avoid that catastrophic outcome. And that's to, of course, reduce greenhouse gas emissions globally from where they are today in the business as usual path that we're on to zero, or in fact, net zero, ideally by 2050, no later than 2070. And so after 300 years of relentless growth in emissions, can we actually reduce emissions to zero in a mere 30 to 50 years? And to answer that question, we need to begin by describing 5 key trends that are beginning to bend the curve on global emissions in different ways. So I want to start with these trends that we're seeing out there in the markets. Then we'll get into what actual products and technologies are out there that are reducing emissions. And then the last part of my talk will be on what investors are doing about it and the strategies they're using. So we'll get to the meat of the presentation towards the end. So the first of the trends that are starting to affect behavior around climate change in business is the manifestation of physical risks. So we're starting to see risks of wildfires, of flooding, of hurricanes. It's starting to now attract attention of businesses. Insurers in particular. Insurers are starting to face huge losses, and they're starting to pull out of markets, for example, fire-prone markets here in the US. And what happens when insurance pull out of a sector is that the rest of that business activity in that sector pretty much comes to a halt. Without insurance, it's very hard for most businesses to be able to actually conduct their business. Houses stop getting built because mortgages can't be issued. A number of other impacts come with that. As a result of this manifestation of physical risks, it's starting to spur significant innovation. And that innovation is in new low carbon and zero carbon products, many of which are technology based, they leverage technologies, and they provide consumers with lower emissions products. In almost all cases, not just lower emissions products, but in fact, better products. And Tesla's just one example. It was rated the best performing car. But it's not just automobiles. There's examples in meat substitutes, in renewable energy, LEDs. We could keep going on the various products that are out there. And that wave of innovation has partly been driven by consumers and employees in companies whose concern over climate change is leading to evolving social norms, especially among the young generation, who believe that, as Greta Thunberg says, quote, our house is on fire. And as you know, I'm sure many high school students have staged walkouts, younger voters are supporting political candidates with green credentials. And the awareness of the dangers of climate change has now become mainstream. And this is a pretty remarkable change in the last couple of decades, when at one point, just a few decades ago, it really was more of a fringe issue. As it's become more mainstream, we do see greater government action. We're starting to see governments globally take action around climate change, not in a coordinated way. International agreements are still woefully inadequate, but you're starting to see a growing percentage of greenhouse gas emissions that are either taxed or capped, which puts a price on carbon. And again, that price on carbon is another influence on business. It's not nearly enough. Today, we're only at about 22% of global emissions have a price on carbon. But that pricing is occurring in many places that don't seem obvious to driving climate change. In the US, at the state level, 30 states today have renewable portfolio standards that help put a price on carbon, including many with Republican legislatures. So what we see is globally increasing government actions, not nearly enough, but heading in the right direction. So we've got changing social norms, we've got government action, and these things are convincing companies to announce what are known as net zero pledges. These are pledges by business leaders to reduce their emissions to zero within some sort of time frame. Today, about more than 5,000 companies have pledged net zero, including many of the world's largest, like Amazon. And Amazon's saying, look, if we can do this, if we can reduce with all our physical infrastructure, and they're planning to do that by 2040. That's why Bezos says 10 years earlier in the Paris Agreement, they're suggesting others can as well. So these 5 trends that are macro trends in the business community are affecting the investment community. And that can be summed up with this quote by Larry Fink. Larry Fink is the founder and CEO of BlackRock, which is the world's largest asset manager today. It's close to, I think, approaching $10 trillion is managed by BlackRock. And his quote from 2 years ago is that sooner than most anticipate, there will be a significant reallocation of capital. What he means by reallocation is away from businesses that are contributing to climate change and greenhouse gas emissions and towards businesses that are reducing emissions or have what we call climate solutions. So where are investors reallocating capital to? Well, this gets us to the area of what we call climate solutions. Now, to be clear, the word solutions doesn't mean solving climate change. There's no solving climate change. We've been living with climate change for many decades, if not hundreds of years. Solutions refers to reducing emissions enough to avoid catastrophic climate change. So when I began working on climate change solutions, this was about just over 20 years ago now, there were no climate solutions. There was, in fact, nothing to invest in. Solar and wind, renewable energy was extraordinarily expensive 2 decades ago. It wasn't very scalable. There were essentially no electric vehicles in the market. And these other products, whether it was LEDs or meat substitutes or other products, they simply didn't exist. What's changed in those last 2 decades is this growth in climate solutions, and that is leading to an opportunity to actually invest capital in it. So I'm going to highlight 5 key areas, 5 key climate solutions, but there are a number of others as well. These are probably the 5 most important though. And the first of these won't surprise you at all, I don't think, for most, if not all of you in this group. And that, of course, is in the growth in renewable energy, essentially solar and wind. This chart shows forecasts for the growth of solar and wind to be more than 50% of global power generation by 2050. And these charts are not the charts of environmentalists or are those with wishful thinking for addressing climate change. BNEF is Bloomberg New Energy Finance, is probably the leading consultancy firm in the sector. But you can look at oil company forecasts. British Petroleum puts out a similar forecast. The International Energy Agency puts out a similar forecast. And they're all showing that this power transition is highly, highly likely to occur. And the reason for that is really pretty simple. And again, I'm sure that most of you know that rationale, which is the change in prices in renewables. Lazard is an investment bank that puts out an annual review of the cost of energy, the levelized cost of energy, which allows us to compare different sources of power generation. And today in the US, without any government subsidies, the two lowest cost sources of power generation are large scale solar, utility scale solar, and wind. And the only competition in the fossil fuels arena is gas, natural gas power generation. Because of these numbers, because renewables has become so competitive on a price basis, it accounts from where most investors are putting capital today in the power sector globally. Last year in 2021, 70% of all capital going into power generation globally went into renewables. And that's a fairly significant number. It's over $300 billion annually in wind and solar alone. So these sectors are attracting the bulk of investment capital today in power generation. Of course, there's a challenge with renewable power generation. Again, I'm sure most of you know that, and that's the fact that it is intermittent. And it requires energy storage to be used 24/7 to balance the grid. Second area of climate solutions and where capital is now flowing is in energy storage. This is primarily in storage using lithium-ion batteries. And the importance of lithium-ion battery was actually recognized by the Nobel Prize Committee a couple of years ago, because it does allow us to transition to a fossil fuel-free world. And this is occurring because the cost of batteries has declined so dramatically. If we look at the lithium-ion battery price outlook, in a decade, it's dropped close to 90%, and will continue to decline in the years ahead. And so as those costs come down, the opportunity to use those batteries for storage and other purposes grows, and investors channel capital into that sector. Where is that battery storage being built and used? Well, if we look back at that photo, if you were to drill into that photo really closely, you'd actually see that those batteries, in fact, are being supplied by Tesla, the automobile company, which brings us to the third climate solution, and that, of course, is electric vehicles. When we look at the EV sector, the automobile industry globally is on a cusp of a massive transition from the internal combustion engine to EVs. Still reasonably early days, but the growth is extraordinary. Now over 8% of automobiles globally. If we look in places like Europe, those numbers are much larger. In December, EV sales across Europe were 29% of all new cars sold. This year, 2022, automakers are offering 61 new electric models. And investors are pouring capital into this sector. The one example that's driving all the other examples in the sector is, in fact, Tesla. The market value of Tesla being over $1 trillion is greater than the value of the next 10 car companies combined. Why is that? Well, simply because not only are EVs increasing in sales today and increasingly popular, but we expect that within a couple of years, EVs will be cheaper than fossil fuel-filled vehicles. And that's not just cheaper on a life cycle basis, because today they already are, because the cost of fueling is lower and they require fewer repairs, but actually on an upfront purchase basis. And at that point, it's pretty much game over for fossil fuel vehicles. Electric vehicles perform better, are easier to maintain, and at that point will also be cheaper. So we have these three big climate solutions that are attracting the bulk of investment capital today. But there are two other sectors that are also just in the past 18 to 24 months starting to attract a lot of interest. And I just want to touch on those. One is green hydrogen. So green hydrogen is created by using surplus electricity from renewable wind and solar, which is increasingly frequent because there are times in the day when there's simply too much power being generated from these projects. And it's used to split water using electrolysis into oxygen and hydrogen. That hydrogen, is an extraordinarily useful climate solution. It's what we call the ultimate decarbonization solution, as this quote from Goldman says, because green hydrogen can be used to fill in the gaps where electrification isn't really feasible. For example, long distance shipping, airlines, areas that need high heat like steel manufacturing, and a number of the other parts of the economy. Until very recently, green hydrogen was really more of a theoretical concept, but investors are now channeling a great deal of capital into this sector. As the cost of renewables comes down, this becomes increasingly attractive area to invest. But even with green hydrogen, and even with renewable energy, electric vehicles, energy storage, we still find that we're left with a gap. That there's certain industries, there's certain activities that humans have that are going to leave remaining emissions no matter how much we try to drive down those emissions. And this will, as a result, require the need for negative emissions. And there are a number of carbon removal approaches out there. The simplest, most obvious one is simply planting trees, which actually turns out to be much challenging than most people think. But there are a number of more sophisticated technologies, mostly around direct air capture, that are today technologically feasible, but high cost and of limited scale. But they are also starting to attract a great deal of investment capital because investors can look at a chart like this and see what the demand is going to be for these technologies in the future and recognize that there's tremendous opportunity there to finance these businesses. One thing that's important to understand about these 5 climate solutions that I described is that they're connected. A lot of analysis and discussion around each of these 5 tends to look at them in a silo. It looks at each one and understands the advantages and the challenges each face. But in fact, they're connected. It's a little bit of a puzzle. And what we find is that as each piece advances, it supports the advancement of the other pieces. As wind and solar power become cheaper, This makes electric vehicles more compelling. It makes green hydrogen cheaper to produce, and it also makes carbon removal lower cost as well. And each of those sectors advances, it increases demand from the other sectors, and it basically becomes a sort of virtuous cycle that started here. An important thing to understand is that this decarbonization follows what we call a carbon abatement cost curve. And this cost curve is an important factor to understand when we think about business, the global economy, and how we're actually going to decarbonize industry globally. The abatement cost curve describes the cost of abatement in dollars per ton of CO2 equivalent. That's the left axis. And the x-axis is the amount of abatement potential for each one of these technologies. And from starting from 0 up to 50+ billion tons of CO2 equivalent per year, which is the total emissions globally. The key is that some of the technologies on the left actually have no cost at all. In fact, they are profitable to reduce emissions and with or without any concern around climate change. If we look at all the technologies up to about 24 billion tons of CO2, or not quite half of global emissions, they are what we call low-cost decarbonization. In other words, we can reduce emissions at zero or very minor cost to the global economy. And that comes from the technology I just showed you, like switching from coal to renewables, some changes in industry, more effective use of agriculture, and so on. And on the right side, we have what we call high cost decarbonization. And these tend to be more focused on industries that find it challenging to decarbonize, or carbon capture, as was just described. So this helps us understand that the carbon abatement cost curve helps us understand where capital is going today. Unsurprisingly, it focuses on the left side of this chart, the low cost decarbonization. But the thing to recognize with the abatement cost curve is that over time, the cost curve is dropping. So this red line shows that's really just this chart, just a line that maps out that chart. That's the red line. Analysts expect, and have good reason for doing so, that over time, that cost curve will drop. And as it drops, investment capital flows into these technologies because they can become increasingly competitive commercially. We still have a challenge at the right end of that curve. The right end of that curve, abatement's extremely costly, but even there, costs are coming down fairly quickly. So this abatement cost curve shows us where we can invest today, where it's commercially attractive to do so, and where in the future we need to look for solutions that are more focused around R&D. If we add up all the investment that's required, it turns out to be a big number. Boston Consulting Group estimates more than $100 trillion to get us that net zero transactions. And that obviously is a large number. But it's a manageable number within the size of the financial markets today. So the question is, how are people investing that money? What actual strategies are investors using? Which gets me to the core of our talk. And let me just take about 10 minutes to take you through that, and then I can take your questions. So investors are actually taking, by and large, 5 different strategies in the year of climate change. And the first strategy, and this is an unsurprising one, is risk management. Investors are looking at the risk of climate change and trying to manage for those. Obviously, they're looking at physical risks, acute risks like extreme weather, and chronic risks like rising temperatures and oceans, and adjusting their investment portfolios to recognize that. But in fact, the bigger area of risk management is not the physical, but it's in what we call the transition risk. How are policies changing industries? What new technologies are changing industries? How's the market changing because of consumer behavior changes? And what are some of the reputational issues around this transition? Now, until pretty recently, investors didn't focus too much on risk management, it's not because they were unaware of climate change. Most sophisticated investors, they understand the science of climate change, but because very few investors look decades into the future. They're not paid to look 20 or 50 years into the future, usually paid for a maximum of 10 years. That's usually the maximum horizon investor. That changed when this individual, who I think you all know is former Governor of the Bank of Canada, he's now back in Canada, Mark Carney, they went to Bank of England, Bank of Canada. When he gave a talk that described how, what he calls the catastrophic norms of the future, that's climate change, are in what they call the tail risks of today. That when you actually model out the risks to investments today, that those investments present value risks in the future that can affect assets today. So let me give you an example of that. Homes at risk of flooding in the future, the flood risk may not occur for another 30 years. So why would investors today care about that if their horizon is just, say, 10 years? And the answer is that the asset they're buying, a home, well, their investment horizon is only 10 years, that asset's value is 30 years or more. In fact, it's almost infinite, 30, 50, 100 years, the value of a home. And if home buyers are increasingly aware of risk to that asset at some point in the future, it's not that they won't buy those homes necessarily, but they will discount the price of those homes. That's the tail risk. And in fact, studies have shown that's exactly what's happening. So research has shown that homes in the US at risk of future flooding, they're not flooding yet today, but future flooding, have declined 7% in value compared to similar or nearly identical real estate elsewhere that's not at risk of flooding. So for many investors, consideration of risk is a key strategy that they're focused on around climate change. But for other investors, that's not enough. They want to employ a different strategy, not one of risk management, but one around divestment. And the strategy of divestment is really a simple strategy. And again, I suspect many of you are familiar with it. And the strategy is a values-based strategy. And it was first put forward by Bill McKibben, famous environmentalist here in the US, who wrote, quote, "If it's wrong to wreck the climate, then it's wrong to profit from that wreckage." It's really a moral argument. And as a result of that argument, the divestment movement has grown dramatically globally. Over $40 trillion in assets has divested from fossil fuels, either partially or fully. And that, in fact, includes Columbia University, where I'm employed. This is a group of students who, in 2016, invaded the president's office here, to push for divestment from fossil fuels for the university's endowment. Columbia University's endowment is fairly large. It's about $10 billion. They want the university to divest from owning fossil fuels. It was actually the first time they'd invaded the president's office since the Vietnam War, when that tactic was widely used by students to get universities to change direction. And as a result of that, the president set up a committee to look into this area. And I actually chair that committee here for the university. And we reviewed fossil fuel divestment. The university had actually a few years earlier divested from coal. These students were pushing for divestment from oil and gas companies. And in fact, we did support and recommend that the endowment divest from oil and gas companies, which it has done, with an exception for companies with credible transition plans to net zero in the future. So second strategy is around divestment, and many investors follow a divestment strategy, including Columbia today. But divestment doesn't actually in any way solve climate change. It simply removes capital and really aligns values of investors with their investments. In order to actually channel capital towards climate solutions, investors follow a different strategy, and this strategy is called ESG investing. ESG standing for environmental, social, and governance factors. In ESG investing, surprisingly, actually begins not with investors, it begins with the UN. And nearly 20 years ago, Kofi Annan, he sort of challenged the business community with this quote. And in 2004, the UN brought together a meeting. It was actually held in Geneva, in Switzerland, where this concept was first discussed. I actually attended that meeting. And somewhat surprising, investors reacted favorably to Kofi Annan's proposal. And analysts began incorporating these environmental, social, and governance factors into their investment decisions. So when you decide, if you're an ESG investor, to, say, buy shares in a company, you would look at that company on its financial metrics, how profitable it is, how good are its products. But you would also look at environmental issues. How is it contributing or helping to solve climate change? What are its social policies and its governments? And then make your investment decision around that. Investors who are interested in ESG normally sign something called the Principles for Responsible Investment, Principles for Responsible Investing, which was started by the UN. And in signing that, they agree to this quote: environmental, social, and corporate governance, ESG issues can affect the performance of investment portfolios. And today, most of the world's assets under management are following ESG principles, over $100 trillion in assets under management. There's an extraordinarily large amount of capital that today follows ESG principles. So we see a lot of capital, some capital focused on risk management, some capital divesting, and now some capital saying we're investing, but we're investing by following these ESG principles. But even ESG investing is not targeted specifically at solving climate change. It's sort of a broader strategy. So some investors are now using a fourth strategy, which we call thematic climate investing. And the idea of thematic climate investing is to pick companies that are specifically designed to help us solve climate change. Nancy Fund is one of the pioneers in this area. Her investment fund is called DBL Partners. And they began more than a decade ago with a thematic climate investing strategy. They only invest in companies that align their business model with a mission to tackle climate change. And in fact, they were one of the early investors in Tesla and did very well by that, but many other companies as well. And thematic climate investors have done so well in recent years that we now see more traditional investors like TPG, which is one of the world's largest money managers, Brookfield, by far the largest Canadian money manager, announcing climate-focused, climate thematic funds. In fact, in a strange coincidence, in one day last year, July 27th, these two funds both announced the world's largest climate funds on the same day, which probably, and they probably really annoyed each other because they each thought they were going to come out with something really special, and turned out they both did. So today, pretty much every large asset manager in the world follows a thematic climate investing strategy, in addition to the other strategies I just described to you. So that's the fourth strategy. But even with those four strategies, there are some climate solutions that are simply too risky, they're too early stage for your traditional commercial investors to participate. And this brings us to our last investing strategy, which is called impact first investing. In impact first investing, are investors who are willing to take more risk than other investors will, or invest for a longer period of time. I mentioned most investors have a 10-year maximum. They'll invest for impact first investors for 20 or 30 years or longer. And the best known impact first investor is, in fact, this fellow, Bill Gates, from Microsoft. And as he says in his quote, he's willing to wait a longer time for returns on other funds. He put $1 billion into a fund called Breakthrough Energy. And the objective of Breakthrough Energy and other impact first investors is to take early stage technology. And there's so many interesting technologies out there today to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in almost every sector you can think of. There's some very innovative technologies that are out there, but they're not yet at scale. And investors like Bill Gates and others are financing those technologies to get them to scale. That's what their objective is. It's extraordinarily risky what they do. They may lose most or all of their investments. On the other hand, some of these technologies will ultimately be very valuable. And so these investment trends are really changing what's happening globally. Morgan Stanley, being one of the world's largest investment banks, is basically concluding that the entire business sector is going to change as a result of climate change. And as a result of that, the earnings these companies use are essentially going to change over time. And in very dry language, unemotional language, Morgan Stanley writes, decarbonization could present a material, economic, and humanitarian opportunity. Or to put it another way, the change that's coming to the global economy will create an extraordinary number of winners and losers. It will change how people invest, and will ultimately decide whether or not we're able to avoid catastrophic climate change. Which brings us to really the only issue that matters with everything I've talked about so far, which in fact, will we avoid catastrophic climate change? Because investment that does not avoid catastrophic climate change is sort of a waste of time at the end of the day. And I get asked this question a lot in my teaching on climate and business. And the answer I give is entirely unsatisfactory to every audience I've ever spoken to. And that answer is a definitive maybe. The maybe is because it depends on the timing of investment. I mentioned earlier in today's presentation that in order to address climate change, we need to invest literally trillions of dollars in capital into new climate solutions. What I haven't talked about so far is the timing of that investment. And that brings us back to the IPCC report that I talked about at the beginning of the presentation about what we need to do. Well, buried in those 3,000 pages report, it's a long report, is really this statement that the New York Times summed up for us very helpfully. What the IPCC report tells us is stopping climate change, or in this case, avoiding catastrophic climate change, is doable, but time is short, the UN panel warns. What they mean by that is that we need to start bending the curve very, very quickly within 5 to 10 years if we have any hope of getting down to net zero. One thing that's buried in that report, by the way, that was surprising to many people who worked on climate change is that scientific models today do tell us, this is just a bit of an aside, that in fact we do get emissions down to net zero, that mean temperature in fact will plateau somewhere between 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. This is surprising because up until this point, scientists have been predicting that even if we got to zero, warming would continue for a period of time before it then declined to this area. But in fact, now the models are suggesting we could keep it below 2 degrees. In order to do that, what the IPCC tells us is really what I just spent the last 30 minutes talking to. Financial flows need to increase dramatically, about 3 to 6 times what they are today. But that capital does exist. And in fact, I've done some work breaking that down. That capital definitely exists in the fixed income markets. It's a little more restricted in the equity markets, but it does exist today. The biggest challenge by far is the gap in developing countries. Now, it's a whole different presentation to make, but that gap exists because of the incremental risks and incremental cost of capital in developing countries. So essentially, the UN IPCC brings us to the same point that I made through the presentation, which is addressing catastrophic climate change requires us to get to net zero. Getting to net zero requires a significant amount of investment capital, and that capital has to be invested very, very quickly. What does this mean for investors? Well, there are 3 implications. The first, climate change will impact business globally, much as technology has in the past, and that's going to create winners and losers in every sector of the global economy. That transition, the low carbon transition, will provide investors with extraordinary opportunity for investment and a real challenge. And investors rising to that challenge is critical if we are to avoid catastrophic climate change. Whether they rise to that challenge because they think it's going to be more successful to invest that way, or whether they rise that way because they believe they must to address climate change. In either case, that's what really matters. This is a topic I've been working on for the last 2 years. As Rick mentioned, I have a new book coming out in September. And my hope in writing the book is that all investors, whether individual investors or institutional investors, that they recognize these changes are coming. They understand what they are, and they change their investment behavior. I believe that'll benefit them individually as investors, and I believe it'll benefit everyone as well. The last thing I want to say, just before I take some questions, is that there have been a number of changes in this sector in the last 20 years. I mentioned earlier that when I began work in this area, there was no investment capital and there was nothing to invest in, and that has changed dramatically. The other thing that's changed is that business schools have significantly changed their focus in this area. Up until a few years ago, there were very few people working on climate change in business schools. That has changed significantly. This is a tweet from my boss, who's a dean of the business school here. His name's Kostis Maglaris. And he actually is a data scientist. He comes out of the world of technology. That's his area of specialty. And he's the one who actually really believes that the trends of the past, the technology trends of the past that affected business, those trends will be climate trends in the future. And as a result, Columbia Business School and pretty much every other major business school is significantly expanding our focus on this topic in the years ahead. So I think it's time for questions. Rick, over to you, and I assume I should stop sharing my screen, correct?
Yes, that's right. Thank you very much, Bruce. A lot of information there, and I would perhaps not be too far from the truth to say guarded optimism, which is always appreciated because many of our speakers reflect a degree of unhappiness with the way things are going. And what I find encouraging here is that there is a way forward, but of course it is very time sensitive. And in this talk today, we have time sensitivity. We've got about 30 minutes remaining, and we have 8 questions, in fact 9 if I allow myself to ask a question at the beginning, which is my privilege as the host. So I wonder, Anitra, you're already on deck. That's good. I will go ahead of you to ask you, Bruce, whether you would like to comment on the effect that the Ukraine-Russian war is having on the way in which investment may or may not go. It's quite a rich question, so I leave it to you to decide how you want to take that question.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I'm happy to address it right up front. And let me begin with the war in Europe is obviously a humanitarian disaster, and the issues around that aspect of the war are extraordinarily troubling. If we just step back and look at it through sort of just an economic and business lens, and what does it mean from perspective of climate change, it's done a couple things. One is it's made it apparent to all that being reliant on fossil fuels isn't just a problem from a climate perspective, it's a geopolitical monstrosity, to put it simply. We in the West are essentially funding Putin to attack Ukraine, and then we're funding Ukraine to fight back against Russia. We're paying for it on both ends. We spent a lot of time talking about that. And so if that wasn't, if the cost of fossil fuels wasn't already abundantly clear, it's now even more so. The second thing it's doing is focusing on the fact that the energy transition is extraordinarily challenging for countries. And the more that we understand that, I think the better that is, that this is opening people's eyes, that you need to consider all the solutions and be very sophisticated. And the way this is manifesting itself is essentially what Germany has done in closing down its nuclear facilities before having a renewable option at scale in place, and really putting themselves in a nearly impossible situation here. And so that's awakened people to we need to use all the technologies at hand to address climate change, not just wind and solar alone. And the third thing I would say is there's a lot of controversy around, wait a minute, now the price of gas and oil is much higher, so this is going to hurt us in the climate transition. And I would argue completely the opposite. And there's two reasons for that. The first is when oil and gas are cheap, as they were until the war, it's much harder to replace them. Solar and wind competes, particularly in America, against natural gas. That's the only other cheap source of power. And so now the natural gas is much more expensive. That actually makes renewables even more attractive. And of course, on the consumer side, when the price of these things go up, people are less likely to use them. Now, an argument's made, well, wait a minute, now all of a sudden these oil companies are making a ton of money. Isn't that a terrible, terrible thing? I would say it's irrelevant. There's no shortage of capital for renewables. Whether they make money or lose money doesn't really make a difference. The only thing that matters is how much of their product we use. If we use more oil and gas, emissions go up. If we use less oil and gas, emissions go down. How profitable they are in that process doesn't change climate change in any way. So a long answer to your question, Rick. You open with a particularly interesting question. Putting aside the humanitarian aspect of the war, which I said is just horrifying, I think we're going to go look back on this war and say, yeah, this is one of the tipping points that helped Europe and America accelerate their commitment to clean energy and energy transition.
Thank you, Bruce. Our next question will come from Anitra Thorhog, and on deck, Mike Nickerson, please.
So I'm going back to the beginning of your talk and challenging something that perhaps you wish you hadn't said, that everything since the Industrial Revolution that has been built has affected climate change. And I think there's an enormous number of activities going on, building things like coastlines, coral reefs, building forests, building preserves of all kinds of things. And the challenges of health for the underserved and other kinds of well-being that people have been working on. And I think it's because when you get into an economic viewpoint, you see the silo called economics, and you have some spin-offs to things like time, and now you have spin-off to climate change and so forth, but you lose sight of the entire human experience and the kind of thing that limits to growth began to allow us to do, which is say, how is everything related to everything over time and over space globally? And I do think that there's an enormous amount of things going on which are built, which are of great value to the human experience, but have nothing to do with money and finances. So they do have something to do with climate change, and some of them are solutions to the climate change, such as my own invention and 50-year carrying out of underwater restoration of plants.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more, Anitra. I mean, we're talking here about natural capital and the value of natural
capital. Exactly.
Yeah, which is absolutely valuable, if not invaluable, in many cases, and certainly restoring things like coral reefs. As someone who's done a lot of snorkeling, some scuba diving, it's critical. What I would say though is the Industrial Revolution and the Agricultural Revolution, which I didn't refer to in my book I write about, that began about 300 years ago. This is the first time in human history, in the 10,000 years of modern humanity, or 200,000 years as human beings, that created enough economic development that for the first time in human history, we improved our economic well-being. Prior to the 18th century, essentially everybody lived in abject poverty. The only exceptions were a few, a few royalty, a few rulers who basically stole from everybody else. And the problem with abject poverty is that the time frame of people living in abject poverty is very short. You're just trying to survive day to day, and you have no surplus. You don't have any surplus of any kind, whether it's physical surplus, wealth surplus, or time and labor to do anything else. For example, to repair a reef or plant a tree or take care of the natural capital. And time and again, we see populations who are extraordinarily poor do great environmental damage because they have no choice. They have to survive.
Yes, of course.
And so the economic gains of the industrial and agricultural revolution have really been extraordinary, almost miraculous. Of course, there's still many people who have not benefited from them, but the majority of people have. The problem, like the catch, the catch to all this is not the natural capital that's also been created. The catch, of course, was the greenhouse gases that have been generated in that process. If we didn't have those greenhouse gases, I would say it really truly was a miracle. Unfortunately, it's a miracle with a dark underside, which is the risk of climate change. Natural capital incredibly important, and preserving natural capital incredibly important. But I think it only occurs when we're well off enough to take care of that natural capital, which fortunately, people like you and I think probably everyone in this group is. We're very fortunate in that sense. I don't know if that answers your question, but hopefully I provide a little insight from my perspective.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Bruce, and thank you, Anitra. Mike, you're on next, and Raymond Lurie on deck.
Well, thank you, Bruce. I found your presentation very encouraging. I just finished John Mayer's book, which also provided a pretty good picture of it's possible. You show the flows of things. I look at the metamorphosis of caterpillars to butterflies, and when it starts, the butterfly is being attacked by the caterpillar's immune system, but eventually it builds up enough butterflyness that all of the rest of the protoplasm flows into the form of the butterfly. So, if the trends that you've shown, they're clearly exponential, and if those continue, we will address the problem. What then does the investment community do to make money? If we have arrived and clearly an expanding material society is not in the cards, do they have any concept of what to do in a post-growth world?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. But it's not one I've ever seen an investor worry about. I'll tell you why. First of all, it's a very long, it's long term. It's pretty theoretical, and in practice, there's no evidence that would ever occur. Even if we got to some sort of post-consumer type society, with one caveat, and the caveat is, if our solution to climate change is degrowth, then it's a whole different world. So I didn't have time this talk, because there's so many different ways we go here to talk about what other solutions are there other than investing, in other words, other than economic growth. And there are certainly those who believe that the solution, very simply, is truly degrowth, that we're measuring the wrong thing. GDP obviously doesn't capture things like climate, and that the only solution is to shrink our economies. The problem with the degrowth solution, again, we could spend a lot of time on this and won't get into it, is Very simple. 11% of the world's population has fully benefited from economic growth globally, and 89% is not. Those 89% are not going to say, well, you know what, we're fine with the status quo, let's just start shrinking now. They're just not. And the second flaw is degrowth simply makes us smaller, but doesn't actually reduce emissions. The only way we solve this problem is to reduce our emissions dramatically. And degrowth would just slow them down.
I'm not talking degrowth specifically. I'm looking more at transformation from a materialistic to a more life-based world.
Yeah, and I which by the way, I think I for one would be thrilled to see something along those lines. I can't imagine any. Let me put it this way: as long as we continue some form of market-based system, it requires, and I say some forms, there are different variants of it. It requires investment capital, and that's, you know, I don't think that's likely to change. And if it does change, it'll be something that none of us foresee. And so therefore, I've yet to meet an investor who's sort of worried about that. Interesting idea, though. Interesting, I think, thing to think about and talk about. I've never seen anyone worry about that.
Yeah. We encapsulate it as more fun, less stuff.
Yeah, and I love that idea. And I'm not sure investors necessarily say, you know, more fun, less.
You need
just a side thought, just a little side thought, and then I want the other questions because I'm watching the time here.
Yeah.
You know, up until about 3 decades ago, most value in investments was actually in stuff. So when you bought a share in a company, what you're really buying was the physical infrastructure. You know, real estate company owns assets. You know, IBM owns buildings and computers and stuff like that. If you look at the value of shares today on, say, you know, S&P 500, New York Stock Exchange, any of these companies, most of the value in those companies isn't in stuff at all. It's in intellectual property. It's in people. It's in humans. You look at the value of Apple. Apple's the world's most valuable company. Well, it was. In the last week or two, things have changed a bit. But you know, at $2 trillion, Apple actually isn't that much stuff. It's people, and that's a pretty remarkable thing. And maybe we are headed to the world you're describing, and it's still a very valuable world from investors. I don't know. I just don't know.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you. Raymond, you're on now, and Dave Doherty on deck.
Hi, Bruce. A very, very interesting discussion. I guess my comment is I've been looking at the investments of in renewable versus non-renewable energy over the last couple of years, and I wonder if you could give us maybe a bit of a review or insight on how fast the switch is happening, because it seems to me that it's happening relatively fast. And how fast would you expect investments in non-renewable energies to essentially disappear, fall in purpose?
Yeah, it's a good question and a tricky one to answer, because year to year, month to month, it's not a straight line at all. It's highly volatile. I do think that graph I showed in my presentation about the power transition, you know, to 2050, that graph showing wind and solar taking 50%, 56% market share. I think that's pretty accurate from everything I've researched and seen. But year to year within that, there's a lot of volatility. And right now, there's 2 things going on that are really disruptive to that transition. The first is oil and gas prices have spiked dramatically, essentially because of the war and some other supply chain constraints. That's one half of the equation. The other half of the equation is, excuse me, renewables, particularly solar, but wind too, are suffering massive supply chain problems. Really dramatic increases in costs on those products, and they appear to be pretty temporary. I mean, a solar panel is mostly made up of polysilicon, which eventually, you know, the input is essentially sand. But in the short term, there's huge supply chain problems driving the cost. So panels that were about 23 cents a watt coming into the US are now more than twice that. So after years of coming down, the past 10 years, every year the price has dropped 10 or 20%. This year it just went up 100%. And then, just as an aside, in the US, we have a massive problem. I've never seen anything like this. The US government has imposed they haven't imposed anything yet. They've opened an investigation to the Commerce Department into dumping of solar panels by China. You know, there's nothing new. This sort of thing happens all the time. But this particular investigation is, it opens up the possibility the US government will impose 200% tariffs on Chinese panels, and it's retroactive to when the investigation began, but nobody knows when the investigation will end. As a result, if you buy solar panels in the US today, you may end up owing a massive bill to the US government for this tariff, but you'll never know it for another period of time. And so pretty much solar in the US is pretty much ground to a halt. No big projects are going forward right now, unless they already have the panels left over from before. A long way of saying, again, I don't want to get bogged down in details here. Month to month, year to year, these industries are very volatile in many ways, and makes it tough as an investor. So the question I did not address in the presentation, but I get asked sometimes is, so, okay, nice presentation. I'm an investor. How do I make money? And my answer is, well, if I knew that, I wouldn't waste my time doing presentations. I'd be out there just investing and making lots more money. But in all seriousness, it's not easy. I mean, these sectors are very, very challenged. So I feel extremely confident in the long-term trends, and these trends are accelerating. They're not linear. They are accelerating. But the near-term challenges can be very disruptive to business investors. And I should also add, I talked about a global perspective. You know, each country, they're different. Even here in the US, we have 50 energy markets in the US. Each state has its own rules. And so within each state, you can have a very different scenario year to year. I'm not sure that helped the answer. I'm not sure the answer you were hoping to hear, but that's the status of it today.
Yeah, it just seems to me that 2-3 years ago was about 30% or so of investments that was going to renewable, but you said last year was 70%.
70%,
right?
yeah.
So that's a massive rapid increase, right? So
Yeah. The trend is very, very clear. And in that sense, it's, I don't think that's going to change. This year it might be off a bit, certainly here in the US, because we have this supply chain problem, this tax problem. But the trend is pretty clear at this point.
Thanks.
Thank you, Raymond. And we now will have a question from Dave Doherty, and Leslie Welsh, you are on deck.
I think you're muted there, Dave.
Okay, thanks, Bruce. Very interesting talk. I want to go back to slide 2, I think it was, where you had a chart that showed emissions going down over time, but also it had business as usual emissions. And I was wondering, how was the line for business as usual on that slide generated? And would it be more realistic to show emissions falling to zero late in the century when the economy collapses completely as temperatures become unbearable if we don't act fast enough and widely enough?
Yeah, and first of all, I did not create that line. That line is just based on scientific estimates. The business as usual line is, a lot of people argue over that. What does that really mean, business as usual? Since business as usual is never static, it's changing. And to your point, if we do not tackle climate change, yeah, it does. Everything goes to zero, essentially. The economy pretty much collapses eventually. So were you to model that out, you would get there. My expectation, and this is not grounded in scientific analysis, it's just based in, just spend a lot of time around human behavior and having been in business for a long time. My expectation is we will not hit those numbers, the 1.5 to 2 degrees declining emissions numbers. We will be slow will be late. But the business as usual numbers are also meaningless too. In other words, neither one of those is quite right. Emissions, whoop, there in the background. The emissions will decline, but not as quickly as people would like. There's, in the IPCC report, buried in there is they actually do scenario analysis. They call it P1, P2, P3, and P4. And P1 is sort of a very nice, we start immediately declining, and it's a very smooth decline. P4 is a much more, we wait a while, we're slow to do this, and it becomes much more costly. But we eventually get there. And I think we're probably more likely on a P4 trajectory. It's going to be much more costly than people expect. And the reason for that is simple. The reason is not because there's a shortage of capital. It's not because there's a shortage of technologies. It's because of the inability of countries to cooperate. My greatest fear around climate change is the rise of nationalism and the inability of countries to work together on any issue, let alone this one. I sometimes start my talks, or somewhere in my talks, I'll say something like, yes, we can solve climate change. And then people get all worked up. And I say, yes, we can. It's not the same as yes, we will solve climate change. And the difference between can and will, can is the technology and the capital, will is the political will. And that's where I have a lot of worry. And if anything, those trends are going the wrong way.
Yeah, that's a very good answer. One quick observation is that I think what's at work here is hopium. It's kind of like opium. And that's what resulted in them not having P5. And P5 is, well, we just keep going until the last minute and then it totally collapses, is what happened to the Maya.
Mm-hmm. It could be. It could be. We'll know that. We'll know that in hindsight. I'm more optimistic than that, though. I'm more optimistic, and again, not because of that I have any insight beyond anyone else, but because we actually can now. In other words, 20 years ago, if you asked that question, I'm not sure that I could honestly say we can do it. We didn't have the will either, but we also didn't have the solutions. Today we do. I just don't know if we will be smart enough to do it.
Great, thanks.
Thank you, Dave. Our next question will be from Leslie Welsh and Martin Riddle. You're on deck.
Hello, Bruce.
Hi, Leslie.
I want to move the questioning a little bit more to microeconomics. You've already talked about the importance of ESG in changing investment climates. And also you mentioned, I believe, that there's no shortage of investment capital for renewable energy. And that I wonder about, but it relates to my question. There's a program that started in Canada, but is now operated by the Underwriters Laboratory to do environmental certification and labeling of renewable electricity generation, renewable electricity products, renewable electricity companies, that is for their stock, and renewable electricity investment funds. And I wondered what you thought of that as a tool to help investors, particularly given that renewable electricity is a very broad field. It's not just wind and solar. And one can imagine biomass fueled renewable electricity that still is associated with substantial environmental problems, and which an investor would have a very hard time coming to a proper understanding of.
Yeah, those are interesting questions. I think they touch on two topics, both of which are interesting and complex. And the first is regulatory oversight for this transition and setting rules around it. And this is a hugely troublesome issue, and one that I also have a lot of concern. Not concerned that the country's not cooperating, because that's a macro concern, but this is a concern on. We have so many companies today pledging reductions in emissions. We have so many companies focused on climate solutions and renewable energy and so on. but there are no standards, there's no rules, there's virtually no government oversight. Here in the US, the SEC has finally put forward some rules about reporting on these things, but even those rules may or may not ever be enacted. And that's a huge problem. Markets don't function without regulation. I mean, they function fine for a while and they eventually, get blown up. And this area is no different. And those rules have to be set in place if we're going to do this effectively, right? So I don't want to speak to any specific rule, biofuels versus other fuels, hard to say, but my point is you need government to set the rules. And the second related issue is in setting the rules, the rule makers are going to have to take some trade-offs, right? There's very little that we can do here that doesn't have some downside. Some folks are going to be unhappy with the outcome. The classic one here in the US, and I suspect it's similar in Canada, maybe a little less painful, is around NIMBYism and the growth of renewable energy. Renewable energy is the cheapest form of power in most places. Renewable energy has tremendous advantages. I'm boring you with those details. The reason you can't build renewables in the US today, other than the supply chain problem at the moment, which will work itself out, is because you can't build stuff in America. It's almost impossible to get permitting to build projects. It's almost impossible to get permitting to put in new power lines. We've been working for 20 years to get a new power line from Canada down to New York City. And it probably will never be approved. One looks at one will be approved and one won't. If the government sets the rules and says, look, we have to tackle climate change, we've got these solutions and so on, they have to put in place rules like, we're going to enforce eminent domain, we're going to change things. And there are going to be some people who are going to be unhappy about that. And if I owned, a piece of beautiful property and someone put a wind turbine right next to it, I'd probably be unhappy too. I'm looking at your background here. I love the turbine in the balloon. But that's the role of the government, is to make those decisions and decide what's for the greater good versus what the trade-offs are. And those are going to be very hard decisions, and then people are going to fight back. So that's a related concern. We need regulation, we need standards, we need enforcement, and we need the government to ensure that, frankly, stuff gets built in this transition. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to get there too. In some ways, sometimes I feel that people talk about the government, certainly in the U.S. here, that the problem with climate change is the government's going to take all our money, going to tax us, and then waste it. I don't think the government has to tax at all to address climate change, certainly in this country. They just have to put in place some smart regulations to make it easier to actually do stuff. And it's not about taxes.
Well, I quite agree with much of what you said about regulations, but I wasn't referring to regulations per se, but rather the voluntary information sector. There is an international standards organization, eco-labeling standard 14,000. And I think the voluntary can solve that problem too, as long as it's credible and widely accepted. So the problem right now, we have the voluntary area where it's really troubling at the moment is in the carbon credits area, which is an area I have a lot of involvement with. And many of those voluntary standards are very weak. They're unenforceable. There's problems around that. Well, one of the interesting things if you may be focusing on the US, is that most US organizations don't comply with the ISO 14,000 set of standards.
Yeah.
So this particular organization that I'm talking about does.
Yeah, so that's good. That's definitely better.
But anyway, it's a microeconomic thing. It won't shift the market, but it might help the market shift.
Absolutely, yeah. And these I don't want to put down voluntary standards because I think they have a big role to play here. So when I say that the issue is the government has the ability to force rule of law, voluntary don't, but sometimes they end up working hand in hand, and the voluntary actually still lead.
Very true.
Yeah. Rick, I'm just watching the clock here. We have about 5 more minutes. I don't want to miss anyone. So how many more questions do we have? I'll go more quickly.
First of all, thank you, Leslie. We don't have, I think Ted Manning had a question. I don't see Martin Riddle, and nor do I see Ted. So it's come to
But
an
it solved the
end
problem on time.
very gracefully, yes. So this has been a very
Not
thoughtful.
allowed to talk because they stopped my video. Ted.
Oh, Ted, hello. Do you have a very quick one? Because Bruce,
Very quick one. Yeah, if somebody would please allow me my video. So, but anyway, I'll start talking anyway. The main point I have is that in my experience working in over 100 countries, I do it mainly through the tourism recreation industry. We find that they are first probably one of the very most vulnerable to any initial climate change, but they also are tight investors. Very few of them appear to be in this sector or any other to spend extra money that they don't have to take lower prices. And so what I'm saying is, what sector is going to lead, whether it's in your country or others, who's going to lead? And which can, in fact, lead the charge to try and actually get real people to begin to invest in longer term futures.
So the challenge of developing countries is real, particularly the poor economies, right? So for example, I don't know which countries you've been operating in, but you look, for example,
actually.
Okay, so, but I think it's I think we need to recognize that when it comes to developing countries, there's really two countries that really matter, a couple other countries that sort of matter, and then a lot of countries that at this point, from an investment perspective, it's not that important. The two that matter are China and India. Obviously, China is by far the largest emitter at this point. And China's a very complex story. They have invested more in renewable energy than any other country in the world. They have more electric vehicles. In many ways, they're the case study on going the right way. At the same time, they've also invested more in coal and other pollutants. So it's a very complex story there. If China doesn't move its transition more in the direction of lower emissions, we're all in an enormous amount of trouble. And that's a complex one. India is similar, but it's sort of behind the curve a little bit. It's got some advantages in that transition and some greater challenges in terms of the dynamism of its economy. But those two we look at less. Is there capital? There's plenty of capital in both markets and plenty of outside capital as well. But in fact, a place like China, in fact, you don't need outside capital whatsoever. Then there are a couple of countries like Indonesia where it matters, but it's less around capital and more about, frankly, things like governance and rule of law and the like. For example, deforestation in Indonesia is a huge challenge, but more capital is not going to fix that problem. It's really more things about enforcing what are already government rules that are being flouted due to corruption and other issues. There's a couple other countries like that, but Brazil in that same category. And then countries like Sub-Saharan Africa, which this is not a pejorative, but they don't matter in the sense that their emissions are so low today, and that trajectory is not going to change that much that fast. And secondly, there's a reasonably good chance that they can leapfrog the fossil fuel infrastructure. That being said, investing in those countries is really hard to do.
Well, is private capital likely to protect its own interests? As I say, I'm mainly working in the tourism industry, which is now the largest. And there's an awful lot of money prepared to, at the very least, be spent to not put their hotel right below the flood line, but not much else.
Yeah. And it's a good question. I don't know. I'm a little doubtful about that part of it. I mentioned one of the strategies is risk management. That's the first strategy. And you're right. They're not doing perhaps as dumb things as before, but that doesn't mean they're necessarily always making the smartest move either. I'm sitting here in brand new business school, moved in January to an entirely new campus here in New York City for the business schools. 2 beautiful new buildings. It's fantastic for teaching, and my office is pretty nice. But it's probably going to be underwater in a couple of decades. We're in very low lands here. We moved. The irony is the main Columbia campus is about 200 feet above sea level. It's up on a hill. So I don't know what they were thinking when they moved down the hill. But yeah, maybe no smarter than the hotel that's on the beach line. I'm not too sure.
I, as a geography, I sympathize. Anyway, thank you very much. Very good.
My pleasure. Nice to chat.
Well, this has been a splendid way, Bruce, of marking our 100th presentation. And I, for one, certainly look forward to reading your second book. I would like to hand over now to our president, Jean Doherty.
Thank you. I'm got to get my video going again, but it has absolutely been my pleasure and privilege to thank you for a wonderful presentation. As Rick says, for our 100th presentation, this was really, really interesting. And certainly you've provided a perspective that most of us have not really had an opportunity to think about. So again, I would really like to thank you very much for this and some encouraging thoughts that you've been able to provide for us. So thank you very much. And it's wonderful for us to see that the business community is starting to engage and perhaps deal with the climate crisis that we all face. So with that, thank you very much. And please look at CanadianCore.com if you wish to see this particular presentation or any of our other presentations that are available on our YouTube. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jean. It's been an honor to do the 100th, and appreciate that. Thank you to everyone for the great questions and conversation.